Now, to make our bronze Muscadine grape wine, we will be using the following. I have 3 pounds of bronze Muscadine grapes. I have 4 cups of white granulated sugar. This time around, I'm going to be using a Red Star Cote Blanc wine yeast. Of course, if you don't have it, use whatever you have. Also, this time around, I'm going to be using regular bread yeast, and that's going to act as our yeast nutrient. Going to need several straining bags to hold our grapes. I'm going to need up to 1 gallon of clean filtered water. I'll need a wide mouth fermenter, something that we can get our straining bags into. I'll need a 1 gallon or 4 liter jug, carboy, demijohn, take your pick, so that we can start secondary fermentation in about a week after we start. Transfer here for here. It will be helpful and indeed necessary to have an airlock with bung. I should also point out that the primary fermenter has its own built-in airlock. If it doesn't, you'll need one of these for this. If not, you will definitely need one for your secondary fermenter. It might also be helpful to have a hydrometer with testing tube. It will help us determine not only what our starting gravity is going to be at the beginning, and hopefully what our ending gravity is going to be at the end, so that we can determine how much alcohol is in our wine. Also, if any problems occur, having a hydrometer will help us with some of those. Also, last but certainly not least, everything has got to be cleaned and properly sanitized. So make sure you have available your food grade sanitizer of choice, whether it's One Step, Star San, or if you're doing it some other method, just make sure that it needs to be done. If you can keep it clean, you can keep it sanitized at the beginning, you'll have fewer problems at the end. And that, my friends, is what I'm going to be using to make this wine. Okay, because these Muscadine grapes have seeds in them, and we really don't want to put these in a blender or food processor because they might chop up the seeds, which might cause a little bit of bitterness later on. We want to mash these grapes up so that we can extract a little bit more of the juice. So, couldn't find my potato masher, but I did have one of these. So I'm going to give this a shot, and let's see what kind of job it does. Working small batches at a time. Probably do more than that, but working small batches at a time. We just want to go in and crush these bad boys up. Get out of there. Both the pastry thing and my hands have been properly cleaned and sanitized, as my straining bags have been. We're going to go ahead and mash up enough of these so that we can get those into our straining bag. Now, I should point out that I am going to mash up more than this before I start putting them into the straining bag, but that is going to be my process. Okay, now that we're over the stove, we're going to go ahead and start bringing some of our water up to a boil. So I'm going to pour in roughly half of our water. Roughly half to start. Go ahead and cover that up. And let's bring that up to a boil. Okay, now that our water has come up to a boil, let's go ahead and drop in our grapes. Yep. All right, and the second one, now that I've tied it off. And go ahead and pour in the rest of our grape juice. Now, the reason why we're doing this is simply because we want to kill off any of the wild yeast that was sticking to the skins of the grapes. And if you are trying to do this as a natural ferment, you can omit this step and move on to the next step. But we've got enough water to cover, and we still got half a gallon left, so we're just going to go ahead and put our cover on, and we can just go ahead at this point and turn off the heat. Now in a small saucepan, you can pour in a little bit of that remaining water. Well, I don't know, anywhere from half a cup, 3/4 of a cup. You really don't need to be precise. And we want to go ahead and add in 1/4 teaspoon of our bread yeast. And for some of you, this might be counterintuitive, but we then want to turn on the heat. And we want to let that come to a simmer. And the reason for that is that the bread yeast is going to be acting as our yeast nutrient. And in order for it to do that, the bread yeast has to be dead. And this is how we do it. We simply kill it with heat. All right, now that we've got a simmer here, we can go ahead and turn off the heat because it has done its job. And we can actually go ahead and add in our now yeast nutrient to our grapes. Put our lid back on and let that come down to near room temperature, or at least where it's warm enough where we can still add in and easily mix our sugar, and then let it come down to room temperature where we can then proceed to add in our regular yeast. Now I've taken the opportunity to add in our 4 cups of sugar, this time with the record button on record, and we're going to go ahead and incorporate it until dissolved. And it's still warm. It could have been done hot or warm. It's entirely up to you. And we're just going to go ahead and get it all in there, mixed up. Yep. And that is done. Now both the spoon and the measuring cup that I'm currently using to hold my grapes were sanitized beforehand, which is something I said prior to me hitting the record button. So we add the fruit back in and the rest of the juice. And now we can let it come down to room temperature. It's now time to take that initial hydrometer reading. And it looks like we are coming in at 1.094 on our hydrometer reading. Okay, for this part of the operation, it's now time to transfer our liquid from our pot to our primary fermenter. And having both just sanitized both the fermenter and measuring cup, it's now time to get this from here, starting with the straining bags, to here. Now, I would strongly suggest that if you have the sink available to you, that this be done over the kitchen sink, because sometimes it can be a little bit messy. And let's see if I can do this without spilling it all over the place. All right. That's not bad. And looking at the measurement on the inside, looks like we're just over, actually we're a little bit over a gallon, but that's with the straining bags included. Remember, we still had some of that water left over, so when we are ready to transfer this from primary to secondary, and we've had an opportunity to remove the straining bags, we can then use the remaining water to bring our level back up to at least 1 gallon. But that having been said, what we still have now is just grape juice, sweetened grape juice. But in order to turn this into wine, we have to do the next step. All right, to begin the process of turning our juice into wine, we need to add our yeast. And as with most of my brews, I usually use 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. If you want to add more, feel free. But I find 1/4 teaspoon works quite well. And go ahead and spread it around. Don't just dump it in one spot. And that's all that's required. Put your cap back on. And once again, I should point out that this particular airlock does have, this particular fermenter does have its own built-in airlock. So I don't need to use a bubbler style airlock like one of these until it's time to use my secondary fermenter, which has a smaller opening where this is going to do some good. And that takes care of this. Now, one more very important thing we need to do is that we need to label our creation, just so that we don't get it confused later on with some of the other stuff that we might be making. Now then, what we are doing is we're making a bronze Muscadine wine. We started it on this date, and our original gravity reading started in at 1.094. Now then, for the next 3 days, we want to go in with a freshly sanitized spoon and give our mixture a good stir, incorporate a little bit more oxygen into the mix, and squeezing down on some of the straining bags to squeeze out a little bit more of the Muscadine grape juice. After that, we don't want to do that anymore. We just want to leave it alone for a total of 5 to 7 days, at which point in time you can go ahead and remove your straining bags and begin the process of transferring your must from the primary fermenter into the secondary fermenter to begin the long secondary fermentation process. Now again, all of these follow-on steps you can find in my playlist, Winemaking Operations, which has separate videos on racking, primary versus secondary, degassing, back sweetening, the whole 9 yards of the process that will lead up to the final taste. Let me rephrase that. Tasting video, which will be added to or appended to this video 12 months hence. I usually recommend 12 months as a kind of a good guideline to wait for your wine to mature, at least to a good drinkable stage. You can drink it really anytime you want, but 12 months seems to be a relatively decent sweet spot. Oh, one other thing. If you like what you see here, please click on the subscribe and notify buttons, or if you like this video, you can click on that favorites button to make a donation. Or you can become a member, help support this channel, or you can become a Patreon, help support this channel. So until the tasting video, I'll see you then.